Good morning. This is John Bushka again. I'm going to continue with the third clip on my series about the professional interview on my book, Do Ask, Do Tell, A Gay Conservative Lashes Back, with some discussion of the second book, When Liberty is Stressed, also. So let me just go right to the file and start playing it from about the 20-minute mark. And I have to get to it. It's 20 minutes and 30 seconds.
And then I went.
It's hard to do this.
Yeah.
Tell me why you started writing all the books.
Okay.
What's the process of writing?
Okay. In 1994, I had been aware of the debate over gays in the military since probably early May or June of 1972, when Keith Meinhold came out over national television. Even then I was aware of it. And then I went to a book signing ceremony at Lambda Bookstore in Washington in September of a book called Honor Bound by Joseph Stephan, who had been a midshipman at the Naval Academy, and he was going to finish third in his class in 1987. And something came up, and he was pressured, and he even admitted that he said that he was gay, even though he had not had any experiences in the military. And so he was removed from the Naval Academy in 1987, about 3 or 4 weeks before graduation. His book was called Honor Bound, and I went to the book signing in 1982. I met him, talked to him a little bit about that. Was at the time that Oregon was trying to pass an anti-gay law at the time, and then Colorado tried, remember, and so those things all blew over in the 90s.
It was Romer versus Evans.
But his story was the most impressive of all. I read the book in one night, literally. It's not very often I do that. And so I talked to the pastor at First Baptist Church. This was in the spring of 1993, so a couple of months after Clinton had been in office. And so it was Everett Goodwin was his name, and he read the book also. So we wrote a little letter about how we thought the policy should be handled, and he delivered the letter to the White House probably 2 weeks before Clinton made his announcement at Fort McNair. And by the way, there's a picture of Fort McNair, and I gave you a picture of Fort McNair, where he announced the Don't Ask, Don't Tell, Don't Pursue. It was mainly Don't Pursue, but I had a copy of the White House letter in my books and everything. Well, anyway, that's then the one other thing that happened in the spring of 1993 is I took a weekend trip down and to North, because I would work, I was still working for USLICO in Arlington. I just simply took a trip down to Norfolk and went to the naval base and took a tour. You could take a tour of the submarines then. So I got on the Sunfish. I actually got a tour of the Sunfish, and that's where that picture of the cap is from. And
I'll provide that later.
You actually got to walk down the stairway and everything. And we sort of had refreshments, and they were selling the caps. And as I remember, I played a game of chess with one of the service members and lost the games, I remember. And one of them was real good at chess. But I saw what the bunks were like and everything. And very, very crowded and everything. And not too far from the bunks was the doorway to the nuclear engine, because this was a nuclear submarine. It had been built in 1963. So I actually toured a submarine. Now, a couple of senators, I think Sam Nunn or one of the others, had toured a submarine like 3 or 4 weeks earlier and made a spectacle of it about how crowded the conditions are on a submarine and everything. But of course, in Joe Stephan's book, and he talked about what it was like because he spent the summers on a submarine. he talked about playing chess too and winning most of his games. I think he bragged about that in the book, as I remember. But he never had an issue living in close quarters with other people, you know, and you see how crowded they are, you know. And so that really made an impression on me. But I hadn't yet decided to do anything to decide a book. What happened was that in 1994, first there was a group called Gays and Lesbians for Individual Liberty, which was a sort of a libertarian group that had been founded by Richard Sincere, who has since passed away. He passed away in 2019. But he and several other people helped organize it. And they had a newsletter called The Quill. And so I published a letter about conservatism and gay rights in the summer of 1994. And then I'd also reviewed Joe Steffen's book in The Quill in the summer of 1994 in another essay. And then I'd gone on vacation to Colorado and landed in Denver, and I drove up to Sterling, which is where UFO cattle mutilations had happened and so forth. And so that's why I was going on visiting on the vacation. I went into a diner for lunch, and there happened to be a local newspaper with a particularly grisly story about violence against a gay person in the military in one of the local papers. Just happened to be when I was having coffee and eating lunch to read it. So I said, okay, I'm going to write a book about this. It was that sudden. And spent the rest of the vacation in Wyoming, everything came back. And then the company was bought, and Uslyco was bought by a company in Minneapolis, which called NWNL.
Northwestern National
Nationwide National Life or something, which bought the company, which emphasized selling to the military. So I realized if I transferred after the merger that would make this a lot less contentious. And there were other things that were interesting that happened on the company that kind of don't really have time for in the book. There was somebody who sued the company over racial discrimination, which wasn't true. It was kind of like one of these woke things even then. And I actually had replaced him as a white male. Of course, I could have claimed I was a member of another group, but I wasn't. You know, I didn't claim that. I just simply, so I testified in this trial. That all got interesting.
Trial, it was just a
but in any way,
deposition.
I wouldn't have put the book out until that was settled. But that got settled out of court. So I started writing the book, and I wrote chapters 1, 2, and 4. Chapter 1 is about the expulsion in NIH. Chapter 2 is about grad school and being in the military. It happened 7 years later. Chapter 3 then was about the fight over gays in the military and Bill Clinton and about Don't Ask, Don't Tell.
Chapter 4.
And then the steps I had, the involvement of the pastor, the White House letter, and all that kind of thing. I wrote 4 other essays about topics about discrimination, marriage, family values, workplace discrimination, that kind of thing. And I've also proposed a Bill of Rights II type amendment in one of the last of the essays. So I sent all of that to a literary agent in May of 1996. And I got the feedback more that it would be better to make more of the book narrative style and less just policy. And so I ditched the having a part 1 and part 2, part 1 is narrative and part 2 is essays, and made essentially sort of like a quasi-narrative. There were 6 chapters. 1 and 2 stayed the same. Chapter 3 was about, I call it my second coming, that sounds like a biblical term, but I came out again in 1973. And then that led to an interesting period. I moved into New York City. That was interesting. I had a sort of a relationship of sorts that was sort of like a movie plot itself, but we won't get into that. But then I moved to Texas because I sort of wanted a new scene after this relationship, actually. And I moved to Dallas in 1979. And of course, you know that in 1981, the first cases of AIDS, of Kaposi sarcoma, were recorded in New York City. And the
Also,
crisis started getting
pneumonia.
worse, the cases started getting worse. They didn't spread as quickly in Midwestern cities as they did in New York and San Francisco and Los Angeles. So we had a little bit of wait time. But there was a very nasty political battle in Dallas. In 1983, somebody in Amarillo introduced a bill in the Texas state legislature to ban gays from all occupations where they could meet the public, because on the theory that maybe the AIDS virus, they didn't know what the virus was yet, because we didn't know that till 1984. But whatever the virus was, it might mutate and become more casually contagious. That was the theory. And in fact, Jordan Peterson this morning, this is really ironic, made a video in which he repeated that incident. This is really ironic that he did it on the day that I'm giving an interview like this. But I put it on Twitter. If you want to look me up on Twitter, you'll find his interview after this. He mentioned this. Really ironic, because nobody's mentioned this for years. Maybe he's read the book, I don't know. But gradually things got better. We got a test. We started developing treatments, and slowly, eventually, once we had protease inhibitors for drugs, slowly it became less acute. And by the 1990s, people were not as panicked about AIDS as they had been for 3 or 4 years in the 1980s. Now, this is beyond the scope of what's in my books, but of course you can compare this to COVID. And the way COVID was spread was totally different. But there's kind of an irony. Many gay men live alone or live in small households, and many were well educated. So particularly in San Francisco and Los Angeles, and I guess in New York, there were very few cases of severe COVID among gay men, which is exactly the opposite of what happened with AIDS. The worst cases were in large households, usually people of color, usually people in lower paying jobs and service jobs. The social and moral implications of the way the pandemic spread are horrific. It's not in the book. I can't sell the book, but in a bigger context, if I can give a 50-minute interview, you could see where this is going, And then, of course, we got Ukraine on top of that, and we got Putin's comments and so forth. So that's the bigger picture. But so anyway, what I decided was that the best way to write a screenplay, and I made written a couple myself. One of them set on a spaceship. That's something else. But the other one is sort of like the biography, is to emphasize chapters 1, 2, and 4, because those are the chapters that deal with the military itself, that deal most with the issue of forced intimacy in closed spaces, which now is a problem today again in women's spaces, women's sports and so forth, although that's not in the book because that's what's happening today. But then it was dormitories in 1961, and then the military in 1993 through until the repeal of the Mass Don't Tell. Now the other part of the story is yeah.
Scott, I need you to put the water bottle down. We're gonna.
Okay, 1350. Okay, I'll pick out a couple pictures if I can find them. Just anyway, here's I've got to try to find them by date. Here's the First Baptist Church in 1990. I mentioned that in 1993 with the pastor. That's where I went. Here's the sunfish cap that I got in the submarine. And here's Fort McNair, even though I said I'd wait till another video. Here it is right now in Washington, D.C. So that'll be it for this video, and then there's one more coming to wrap up this professional interview. And thank you very much for listening.